Welcome back to our weekly Moto News Show, where this week we'll take a look at Ducati's stunning new XDiavel V4 power cruiser, a new electric bike that's about to come to the market that I might actually want, and also Harley's annual results, which it's got to be said don't look particularly healthy. Plus, there's a potentially controversial new voice command feature from Kawasaki, good news for Honda, especially on their GB350S, and we'll wrap up with a stunning one-off R1 that you can actually ride on the road. So let's get underway with that big story of the week, and it's the new XDiavel V4 from Ducati. Basically, the Diavel started life in 2011 as a V-twin with a really sporty and lithe chassis that made it, I think, the best performing power cruiser on the market. Then, in 2016, they introduced the option of the XDiavel, and while a lot of the rudiments are very much the same as the standard bike, they just chilled it out a bit, especially in the riding position with forward foot controls as opposed to the mid-pegs of the standard Diavel. Subsequently, both bikes have evolved a little bit over the years, but there was a major update in 2023 where Ducati moved the Diavel over to their V4 platform, following on from the Panigale, the Street Fighter, and also the Multistrada adventure bike. This new Diavel V4 was absolutely wild, and it still is, with a riding experience that feels much more similar to a Super Naked in many ways than it does to anything on the cruiser market. The free-revving V4 engine with 168 horsepower is blisteringly quick, and the rest of the spec of the bike, including the brakes and suspension and the rider aids and tech, is absolutely up to the job as well. Really, the only thing that distinguishes it from a sporty naked is the oversized dimensions and perhaps the slightly lower than average seat height. But look, when they made that update to the Diavel V4, the XDiavel, well, that stayed as a 1260 V-twin with just a few special additions here and there over the years to keep it looking kind of fresh. Today, though, they announced that this model is also making that leap over to the V4 platform, and boy, does this thing look good. Naturally, it gets the same V4 Gran Turismo engine as the regular Diavel V4, and that means the same ridiculous performance figures of 168 horsepower peak at 10,750 RPM and 126 Nm of peak torque at 7,500. All of the same features are carried over as well, with the extended rear cylinder deactivation, which keeps the rider cool at lower speeds as well as helping with fuel economy. A counter-rotating crank also works against the gyroscopic inertia of the wheels to help with agility, and it gets the signature twin pulse firing interval, which gives the Ducati V4s their own distinctive character, projected out through a quad exit silencer just to really ram home that it's moved to a V4. As for the chassis, well, the signature steel trellis frame makes way for their aluminium monocoque front frame, along with an aluminium swing arm and an aluminium subframe, which are attached to the rear of the engine, which accounts for a large part now of the bike's structure. The result is a bit of a weight saving over the 1260 V-twin versions. They say between 4 and 6 kilograms depending on which spec. And while that isn't necessarily a mammoth amount saved, you're coming from what was already one of the lightest cruisers on the market by some stretch. Wet without fuel, they're saying this new bike comes in at 229 kilograms. So with the big 20-litre tank fully topped up, you're probably looking at about 245 kilos. Now, for reference, one of the closest competitors has to be Triumph's Rocket 3 GT, and that comes in at, I think, 317 kilograms fully fueled up wet. So that's a good 70-ish kilos, which is basically the equivalent of carrying, a middle-sized passenger. As with before, the components are top drawer as well. You've got a chunky 50mm upside-down fork and a piggyback shock at the rear, both of which are fully adjustable. Brembo style brake calipers up front on big 330mm discs. And then Pirelli Diablo Rosso 3 tyres with that massive 240 section at the rear. The list of tech as well, again, is relentless, with 4 riding modes, cornering traction control and ABS, wheelie control, launch control, a quick shifter, keyless ignition, LED lighting with a welcome function, TPMS is available, phone connectivity, and it's all managed through a 6.9-inch color TFT display, which has a whole bunch of different ways that you can lay it out. So clearly, a bike that's built to perform, but just with a slightly more relaxed cruiser riding position and a low seat height of 770mm. But I will say, aside from, the spec and how it looks like it'll go, I absolutely love the styling on this one, and I think it's just got a bit more finesse than the standard Diavel V4, which is a bit more aggressive in the styling. They've softened the look of this one a bit with the more rounded headlight, but also the sculpting of the side panels and the tail end just altogether looks a bit more tidy to me. Two colors are available, of course, with a stealthy black lava, but I think my pick of the two would be the burning red, which is a bit of a departure from the usual flat Ducati red, but I actually think it's got a bit of depth to it, which gives it a bit of a feel of quality. And so yeah, definitely looking forward to seeing this one in the flesh. Now, no price on this one as of the time of writing this video, but a standard Diavel V4 stars at £23,995. So if you're expecting or hoping for a bit of a bargain with this XDiavel, then you're probably going to be fairly disappointed. Still, let me know what you think of it in the comments. Is this the most desirable power cruiser now on the market, or is there something else that you'd rather have, like the Rocket 3 or maybe one of the Harley lineup? Let me know down in the comments below. Moving on to something a little more economically minded though, Swedish electric motorcycle manufacturer Regent recently announced a new model, and while I'm usually a bit underwhelmed by new electric bike announcements, this one actually looks like it could be quite good fun. It's called the Regent Turbo, and I think they've got a lot right with this one, including the price, which isn't too bad considering it's an electric at €9,995, and I think the specs look pretty reasonable too. Top speed is quoted at 120 kilometers per hour, so that's about 75 miles per hour. And so while it's still probably a bike that's realistically best off in the city, you could still throw in a little bit of motorway work and not feel like a complete sitting duck. Then the acceleration sounds decent too, with 0 to 100 kilometers per hour, which is basically 0 to 60 miles per hour, being quoted at 4 seconds, probably helped by the fact that it makes 46 kilowatts of power, which is equivalent, I believe, to around 60 horses. Now, battery capacity is said to be 7.5 kilowatt hours, and that's good for 150 kilometers or about 90 odd miles of mixed riding, so a bit of city work and a bit of open road, and that's probably achieved with the combined braking system, which is going to give you a bit of regen when you are decelerating. So look, not masses of range for this one, but I think enough for city riding where electric bikes like this make the most sense, and 20 to 80% of charging is around 2 hours as standard, but you can also upgrade it to fast charging and get the same in about an hour. A bit like the XDiavel though, what gets me most excited about this bike is the looks as opposed to the specs. Regent have got a history of making these classic looking electrics, but I think this one might be their best work yet, with a bit of a look of a Enfield Interceptor or a futuristic looking Bonneville, I guess. Black Thunder is perhaps the more understated colour choice, but the one that I really love is this Purple Rain version, which one assumes has to have taken a lot of inspiration from like 80s and 90s dirt bikes. Specifically, the white wheels, the purple fork gaiters and shocks really help this one pop, and so I'd happily be riding one of these to get around town. Thing is though, on top of that, they've also launched, in order to kind of promote the announcement of this new model, a single make race series in Sweden, and the race bike looks pretty fantastic as well. With the full fairing, the slim seat unit, it has the bit of a look of a classic cafe racer, but they've also added a bit more punch under the covers to make it more appropriate for the track. Peak power goes up to 52 kilowatts or about 70-ish horsepower, and they've also fitted it with a push to pass feature, which should maybe add a bit of entertainment to the racing. Then they've increased the top speed to 190 kilometers per hour, which is about 120 miles per hour. And so sure, look, the limited range means that races will be restricted to about 8 or 10 laps, but with 4 dates announced through the summer in Sweden, it does look like it could be quite a good watch. Still, what do you reckon to that standard production version though? Could it tempt you out for a spin on an electric, or are you still petrol only? Let me know what you think in the comments. Now, in last week's episode, we talked at length about the financial difficulties that KTM are currently facing that are pretty severe and have resulted in them massively discounting a lot of their new bikes in order to clear a humongous backlog of around 250,000 bikes, I believe. But it might not just be KTM struggling in the years to come, with Harley also recently releasing their annual results, and they don't necessarily make for particularly pretty reading. Ride Apart took a bit of a dive into the figures, so definitely check out their story if you want the full write-up. But in short, their Q4 results for 2024 were down 47% year over year, and in that same period they reported an operating loss of $214 million. Then for the entire year, their operating income or operating profit, while positive at $278 million, is actually down by 58% versus 2023. Why? Well, it doesn't take a genius to figure it out. If you look at their sales across the globe in all the sort of different geographical regions that they operate, well, they're down. So they're selling fewer bikes and making less money. Now, like I say, operating income or operating profit was still in the positive, but you've got to say that's a massively steep downward trajectory for 2024 versus 2023. And so potentially that could signal problems in the years to come, especially if they don't really adapt or change. Looking back at the bikes they've announced so far for 2025 as well, we covered this a couple of episodes back. Well, unfortunately, they're pretty much the same as previous years, with more cruisers and tourers with minor tweaks, some super expensive CVOs, and really the only particularly new thing of note was the Pan America, which got the new road-biased ST version with a 17-inch front wheel, but that one is maybe a bit niche in its appeal, and I don't think it's realistically on its own going to transform Harley-Davidson's fortunes. So on this one, I'd love to know your take down in the comments. Why do you think Harley are selling fewer bikes? And what could they change to improve their business in 2025? Will they start to struggle soon, or does the sort of timeless appeal of the cruiser and the hugely strong brand that they've got as well mean that they'll pull through? Let me know. To be honest though, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but the whole market is looking like it could struggle this year, with the cost of living up and bikes generally being a bit of a luxury for most people that are, a simple choice to cut out. That could be reflected in the latest industry figures in the UK, which come from the MCIA or Motorcycle Industry Association, as reported this week by MCN. So January 2025 numbers were down by about 30% year over year, with 4,201 bikes sold as opposed to 6,043. Well, I say sold, but this is actually registration data, the dealers registering the bikes, and so that could account for some of the drop, with Euro 5 plus emissions regulations coming into play at the beginning of this year, meaning that a lot of dealers have pre-registered their bikes in December in order to be able to sell them this year, and that means they wouldn't necessarily show up in the January figures if they did sell them, because they've already registered them in December. Still, that doesn't change the fact though that this is a fairly common theme in the data over the past couple of years. An MCN quote Tony Campbell, CEO of MCIA, as saying, "We'll be keeping a close eye on the market as we move out of winter and into early spring, where it will be a critical period for the rest of the year." Still, there is a little bit more depth in these numbers, and one manufacturer who seems to be getting it right is Honda. Over the past couple of years, they've come up with some really aggressively priced bikes like the 750 Hornet, the new CB1000 Hornet, and also for 2025 the GB350S. And it seems like, from what I'm seeing in the MCIA figures anyway, that they really are hitting the mark. According to January sales data, the NT1100, for example, which is another great value bike, well, that's been the best-selling tourer and the best-selling Liter Plus bike, beating both the BMW R1300 GS and the GSA, which are both usually top of the tree when it comes to over 1,000 cc's. Then the CB1000 Hornet is the best-selling naked bike too, and the GB350S is the best-selling modern classic and also the bestseller in the 125 to 500 class. To me, that's particularly impressive because they've beat a lot of strong competition, with the Triumph 400s, for example, being featured at the top of the list last year very frequently, and also Enfield's 350 lineup generally filling those top spots if it wasn't the Triumphs. But look, I don't think it's any surprise that a £3,949 bike is selling particularly well at the moment. And the same for the Hornet, the CB1000 at $8,999 for the standard bike and $9,999 for the fancy SP version. Perhaps Harley could learn a thing or two from Honda, although realistically it's Honda's humongous sale figures. We talked about that last week. They sell 20 million motorcycles, or two-wheelers let's say, across the globe in a year, that mean they've got the scale that's perhaps required to make such aggressively priced bikes. Fair play though, it does seem to be working, and ultimately more great bikes on the market at a lower price point is always going to be good for the average biker. And we've actually got both the GB350S and the CB1000 Hornet SP in the studio at the moment for review, so do keep your eyes peeled for those videos as soon as they go live, where we'll find out if they're actually as good as these initial sales figures suggest. And of course, if you're new here and you haven't already, do hit subscribe to see those in your feed. Elsewhere though, Kawasaki have just announced more details of their new voice activation feature, and while it does sound rather handy, I think it might signal a trend in the industry that potentially a lot of you might not like. I mean, from the name you can probably imagine largely what it does, but again, I saw this one on MCN and they say, after having spoken with the Kawasaki factory in Japan, that with 18 available commands, users can make phone calls, check the weather, adjust the volume, access navigation, and monitor vehicle information. This feature will be available on the Z900, the Ninja 1100SX, and the Versys 1100s, so pretty much the main new bikes that they've updated for 2025. And while it is at the moment limited to specific markets, you know, they are pretty much all of the big hitters for this sort of bike, including the UK, the US, Japan, and most of Europe. Now look, this tech isn't for everybody. I know that I get a lot of feedback in the comments that people don't want this level of gadgetry built into their bikes. But personally, from time to time, I can see it being useful because I use Siri in my van quite a lot, so I don't have to take my eyes off the road if I have to mess around with some settings or CarPlay or something like that. With a Bluetooth headset paired to the bike, presumably you could get a similar experience with this. But the thing is, in order to use this new service, what you'll actually need from Kawasaki is an annual license. Now, the official Kawasaki page about this feature reads as though you might get one included, a license, if you buy a new bike, but it will only last for a year, after which you'll have to renew it. The license is linked specifically to the owner, and so if you sell the bike, it won't transfer over to a new owner, although if the initial owner buys another Kawasaki, they can transfer it to their new bike. This feels like a bit of a direction that was perhaps started by KTM when they started to introduce features like their quick shifter or cruise control system that were physically on the bike, but you had to pay for the software to unlock them, and it definitely annoyed a lot of people. Thing is though, that was just a one-off fee, whereas this is more like an annual subscription, which I guess you'll find more commonly in the car industry, but it was pretty controversial there as well. I'm thinking back to when BMW started trying to charge for their heated seats at about 15 quid a month, and eventually had to can it because of the customer backlash. So look, what do you make of this one? A rip-off, or just the way of the world now that we're going to have to pay subscriptions for features? Let me know what you think down below. Let's round off this week though with some seriously drool-worthy machinery with a one-off Yamaha R1 build by Crescent Yamaha. You see, the R1 was recently discontinued in some markets with, increasingly strict emissions regulations coming in, and also sports bike sales dwindling and potentially expensive bike sales dwindling too. You can still buy one in the UK for 2025 though, but it's in a track-only spec as the R1 Race, and so from now on, you won't be able to buy an R1 for use on public roads. This one though, well, it's built upon the very last outgoing road legal version with a whole bunch of goodies fitted though to turn it into this ridiculous spec, and it might just be the ultimate last chance R1. No doubt you'll have noticed the Rossi inspired paint job, which celebrates his well-documented, MotoGP successes, carbon tank extender and a racing seat unit, upgraded Öhlins suspension and Brembo brakes, lightweight Marcassini wheels, and an Akropovic exhaust system, and many, many more features. To me, this is one very special looking bike, but unfortunately that is reflected in the price at £34,999. Still, we can all dream. As always, leave your comments below. We always enjoy reading them. And I'll put last week's episode on the screen now so you can give it a click in case you missed it, where we looked at KTM's massive discounts, some updates to the Goldwing, a new Enfield Shotgun 650, and a new candidate as well for potentially the world's fastest motorcycle. Do hit subscribe if you want to see more of the latest motorcycle news like this right here on MOTOBOB. A massive thanks for watching today, and we'll see you in the next video.